and I let's talk about Tenet. 2 words. Goated movie. Seriously though, if you haven't seen Tenet, go watch it right now and then come back. It will break your brain because it would seriously, honestly break a genuine supercomputer, quantum computer, because it's so confusing. But if you watch it and then break your brain and then come watch this video, hopefully I can put your brain back together. That is not legally binding. You cannot sue me if your brain is still broken after you watch this video. But I'll give it my best shot. I love this movie so much. I think it's so imaginative, so creative. Chris Nolan did it again. He broke our brains in Inception, and now he broke our brains in Tenet. And he did it perfectly every time. But the people he gets these casts. John David Washington, killer. Robert Pattinson, killer. Elizabeth Debicki, killer. Kenneth Branagh, killer. Aaron Taylor Johnson. Surprisingly small role in this movie. Also killer. But how does the time travel work? The time travel in Tenet is quite simple, actually. Imagine with me for one moment that you have a two-way street. One way moving forward and one way moving backward. You are naturally driving on the forward path, always trudging further into time and away from the past. Now, imagine, on like I-40 in Tennessee, they've got those emergency vehicle turnaround points. You don't have the authority to drive through those and go on the other side. Imagine if you did, though. This is what a turnstile is in the Tenet movie. Now, imagine you have driven from the positive section, which is what we will be calling the forward into time section. You've gone from the positive side of the road, you've driven onto the turnstile, and you've driven now into the negative side of the road, which means you are going backwards in time, aka toward the past. You have not changed your position in time, you have changed your direction in time. Now, this also means that both streams must always exist simultaneously, which has some crazy effects, most including when you go forward into time along the positive vector, go through a turnstile, you come out at the same point in time that you went in, since both time streams exist simultaneously, both versions of you exist simultaneously. So now, essentially, you have done what I call temporal cloning. Temporal cloning is the term I've coined for the effect in which you have a positive version of yourself and a negative version of yourself existing at the same time in space and time. One of you moving forward and one of you moving backward. Since you are both physically there, you have effectively cloned yourself. The interesting thing about temporal cloning is that it works both ways. When you go back in time as your negative self and re-enter a turnstile to go back into the positive time stream, if you are a car and you're driving back onto the positive section of the road, you do not erase the existence of the positive you that first entered the turnstile. Instead, there are now two positive cars driving on the same road, which means temporal cloning has worked again, and there are now effectively three versions of you existing in space. Two of you are positive cars, and one of you is a negative car. Okay, enough with the accent. Now that we have a basic understanding of temporal cloning, how does that affect the story of the movie? How many of you can there be at once? I think in order to kind of wrap our heads around this, let's start with the protagonist. That's his name. John David Washington in this movie, his name is the protagonist. I'm going to call him John David Washington because put some respect on my boy's name. Okay, here we go. So, John David Washington, the protagonist, he's essentially participating in a temporal pincer movement, which means one team is coming from
reverse time on the negative road, and one team is coming from the positive side. And they explained it in the movie where, like, when the negative guys go through, they observe, and then they flip positive so they can tell the positive guys exactly what's going to happen. It's pretty cool, pretty mind-bending, but it means that the simpler road is the one where you're already existing on the first road, on the positive road. John David Washington starts on the positive road, as I've called it. He's one car, and he spends the entire movie as one car until the car chase in Estonia, when after Kat gets shot, he inverts, and he goes and he attempts to get the plutonium back, and then travels back to Oslo. Now, at that moment, he claims it's his first time ever inverting. Meaning, according to that positive time stream version of John David Washington, there are now 2 John David Washingtons, because he's never done it before. So, he goes all the way back to Oslo, where he reinverts in order to help save Kat. Now, that version makes 3 John David Washingtons, because at the moment of his reinversion, there's a John David Washington in Oslo fighting a negative John David Washington, while there's simultaneously another positive John David Washington from when the negative John David Washington gets reinverted. That's how one guy can fight 2 guys, aka the really crazy mind-bending scene where John David Washington fights himself and Neil fights John David Washington as well. He travels forward in time a little bit until they start to figure out more of the plan, and then they find out that Stalsk 12 is a big deal. They need to go back there. John David Washington reinverts 4 John David Washingtons. Now, this inverted John David Washington goes all the way back to Stalsk 12, reinverts again 5 John David Washingtons. This is the most John David Washingtons that exist in one time in the film. Actually, John David Washington and Elizabeth Debicki's Kat are tied for second place for simplest journey, only beaten by Sator, Kenneth Branagh's character, who goes forward in time and is always forward in time up until Tallinn, where he goes back in time, and since he doesn't have to go heal Kat at Oslo or whatever, he just goes all the way back to Stalsk 12 and reinverts only once, meaning that there's only ever 3 Sators in existence at one time. So the ranking currently stands Sator in last place with 3 clones, John David Washington and Kat in second place with 5. But it raises the question, how many Neils? Neils. How many? Could somebody give me a count on the Neils? Yeah, I'd like to know, how many Neils? You ever think about how many Neils there are? Okay. Elephant in the room. Neil is the other side of the protagonist's temporal pincer, meaning he is coming from over here, way up here, out of frame. He is coming from way in the future to execute this temporal pincer and come down on the negative road. Yet, the version of Neil we see join John David Washington is a positive version before the Oslo thing. And we see later he's also at Stalsk 12, he's also at the Opera House, which means, at the very least, Neil has traveled backward in time throughout the entire movie, meaning, minimum, there are always 2 Neils. There is never a single Neil in the entire film. In order to not make it confusing, though, let's follow chronological Neil. We have positive road OG Neil, astrophysicist, super cool, reinverts for temporal pincer, comes back down the timeline, goes to the opera, has a great time, only a couple bombs, and then he reinverts. Now, this reinverted Neil is the one that John David Washington meets to go break into the Indian lady's home. Just watch the movie. And then he also gets recruited for the Oslo job, and we're following the events of the film in forward time. So we're always with this Neil, and he just goes all the way up to the car chase in Estonia before reinverting with Kat to try and save her. It's a thing about getting shot by a reverse entropy bullet. It's like the wound is worse unless you're inverted, so they invert to get her back to Oslo. When Neil inverts, this moment right here is the least amount of Neils that are actually, like, in the film chronologically speaking. Now, I said there was like two Neils up here, one going forward and going back, but we never actually see those moments in the film. So according to the moments on screen that are captured, this is the least amount of Neils in the film. There are 4 Neils in the film at this point. I'm reading my script. I'm getting a little confused here too. So, we have these 4 Neils. They go to Oslo. They save Kat. Hooray! They reinvert in order to have Kat saved. 5 Neils, I'm pretty sure. Then, they gotta reinvert to go back to Stalsk 12. So if my math is right, I think that makes 6 Neils. I don't have 6 fingers on this hand. 6 Neils. I'm not the 6-fingered man. 6th Neil, Neil number 6, going back to Stalsk 12. They're going to do another mini temporal pincer, which actually narratively is really cool because it's the first time we hear about temporal pincers, and then it's later revealed that this whole movie has been a temporal pincer. Because it's Now, he goes back to Stalsk 12, and he's on the reverse end of the temporal pincer, but because he's gone all the way back in time to a week before Oslo, there's only 5 Neils at one time, because the opera is happening at the same time, sort of as like a distraction, because nobody would be looking for anything to happen in Stalsk 12 if there's something going to happen to this opera. So, 5 Neils. Neil is doing the fight in reverse. Then, during the fight, he inverts. So now, 6 Neils again. Now we're cooking. Positive Neil goes back through the fight again with negative Neil, gets all the way to the end of the fight, has a lovely heart-to-heart with John David Washington. Mad Lad reinverts to go back and take care of exactly what he needed to take care of. So genuinely here, first of all, 7 Neils. Not exactly sure how, but I got off by a Neil here. So 6 Neils. Second of all, I'm about to do a big spoiler. It's probably on screen if I figure that out. Big spoiler. Neil dies. But how though? Because we've got to remember that right now, Neil is inverted. This means that while normal people experience cause and effect, Neil is experiencing effect and cause. To think about it properly, remember that fight in the Oslo airport where John David Washington stabs himself and then he presses the gun against the stab wound and he's like, ah! You know that bit? That is inverted John David Washington, who is the one who got stabbed. Now, to get to the Oslo fight, he is riding in the shipping container with Kat and Neil. On the way to the airport itself, inverted John David Washington is inspecting his gear, and he notices a tear in his uniform, and then notices a cut open up on his arm, seemingly a fresh wound, and he's not exactly sure where he got it. Now, this is because John David Washington is inverted. Remember, effect before cause. So, in order to be stabbed, he must first bleed, aka a wound that is healing over, in reverse, is opening up. For an inverted man, to be stabbed is to be healed, because your wound has opened up, and then the foreign object enters your arm, and then exits, and the wound, since it is being reversed, has now sealed up completely, and you have undamaged skin upon the removal of the foreign object. This inverted injury offers an interesting problem, though, because John David Washington was stabbed with a foreign object, which was applied to his arm and then removed. So he can properly heal because the foreign object is no longer in his arm, even in inverted time. So how does Neil get shot? Because if Neil were shot by a normal bullet, the events of his life would play out like this. Inverted Neil rises up from the ground, and the bullet enters his cranium, and then he unlocks the gate and goes on living. I don't know about you, but living your entire life with a bullet in your head, waiting until the moment that it is finally removed upon your death, would be really, really hard for anyone to do, and I don't think that that's the case. We know that the bullet didn't exit because John David Washington, who's behind him, who is the original target of the bullet, is left unscathed with no shrapnel, no blood spatter, no nothing. So Neil's head did catch the bullet, which would make it the case that that bullet continues to exist in his head through his inversions all the way back down to his birth. Pretty sure they would catch that on the medical scans. Don't get me wrong, Neil dying by being unshot in the same way that John David Washington was unstabbed would be so freaking cool. We would be so cool that originally I actually thought that this is what happened. And I had planned a whole video around explaining that until I had done my research and watched the video more closely to see that no, actually, when he rises up, he does not fall back over dead. He instead opens the gate and then continues living. Meaning that if he were to get unshot, the bullet would have to come from behind him in the same way that Kat gets shot by a bullet that is passing from a window to a gun, and she is just in the way. If the bullet were to remain in Kat's body, she would have to live with that bullet in her body forever, sort of like how that piece of glass has a bullet hole in it until the moment it's unshot. So for Neil to be unshot as the method of his death, the bullet would have to come from behind him and make its way to the gun with him simply in the way of it. But since we know that his head contains the bullet, we know that this isn't the case. But look a little closer at the clip. Look right here, at the moment that the bullet actually enters the gun. We cut, we see Neil, he gets shot, we flip perspective really fast, and we see the guy who had shot the gun, and we see the motion of the gun. That motion of the gun looks really peculiar, almost exactly how it looked when John David Washington was first learning about reverse entropy by receiving bullets that were inverted into a gun out of a wall. I'll put a screenshot up so you know what I'm talking about. This would suggest that the bullet that Neil was shot with was also inverted, which clears a whole lot of things up, because we're dealing with reverse entropy here. And reverse entropy only does weird stuff according to people who have normal entropy. If two objects share the same entropy, they interact with each other exactly how you would expect them to. Meaning, if Neil was inverted and the bullet was inverted, Neil and the bullet, as the only two parts of the equation, would interact exactly how a regular person and a regular bullet would interact. So here is how I think Neil dies exactly from his inverted perspective. Inverted Neil goes to start the mission, and he follows everybody until Blue Team clears the debris from the exploded tunnel, and he runs into that tunnel. Now, upon entering the bomb room, he finds the protagonist and the evil bad guy having a reverse fight. He sprints through. He opens the gate to go aid them in their fight. When he opens the gate, the protagonist and Ives back through the gate to get onto the side where we find them originally in the movie. Then Neil closes the gate behind them and gets shot and falls over. One really interesting and kind of amazing thing about Neil's death is that according to the normal time stream, Neil dies without a body. Think about it. He gets up from being dead and then goes back and lives on his inversions, and then, according to an inverted perspective, goes all the way back until his birth. So he doesn't exist, he's born, he goes all the way through, he dies, and he also doesn't exist. But something extra that's really, really interesting to me is something I haven't exactly touched on yet about reverse entropy and inversions, is that when you reverse your entropy and go from the positive road to the negative road, you physically exist in both spaces, but because you physically turned around on the road, you never made any progress past the point that you turned around, until such a time as you reinvert back onto the positive road and live past the moment of your original inversion. According to those around you who do not also get onto the opposite entropy road, you stop existing. You cease to exist. So we know that Neil is from the future. He is from John David Washington in the future's mega temporal pincer movement. And we also know that he's living in his own past and he dies in his own past, meaning that he never made it further into the future than the moment that he inverted for the mega temporal pincer. So Neil kind of dies twice. Once in the pit with the bomb room, and once when he inverts, because according to those people in the future, Neil will never come back and Neil simply stops existing. But because he's inverted and he rises up from his own death, according to the positive time stream, there's no body because it's up and moving, and then there's no body in the future because he stops existing. So there's literally no way you could bury Neil because there's literally no body that he has. So, all in all, how many Neils are in Tenet at one time? Well, the maximum total is 6, which is less than I was expecting, to be honest, but it's really cool that he achieved that feat twice in the same movie. He did it when they went to Oslo, then the Oslo numbers got removed when they went to Stals 12, but he added them back during the Stals 12 mission. So he successfully reached 6 Neils twice, 2 separate times, which is honestly even more amazing to me. Thanks for watching.
Neil, my sweet, you were faithful and true. No one could be as cool as you. My only regret with the way that you died is now I have nothing to remember you by. Goodbye, farewell. I'll see you on the other side with stories to tell. Goodbye.